The objective is deception. We convince them the main force is here, and they'll chase ghosts.
In April 1945, Berlin is a city of ghosts and ruins, a smoldering testament to a failed empire. Below the shattered streets, 55 feet underground, in a damp, concrete labyrinth known as the Führer bunker, the man who lit the world on fire is about to be consumed by his own inferno. Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany, leader of the Third Reich, is a broken man. The tremor in his left hand, a symptom of Parkinson's disease, is now a violent, uncontrollable shake.
On May 5th, they exhumed two bodies, a man and a woman, so badly charred they were almost unrecognizable. Alongside them, they found the bodies of two dogs, presumed to be Blondie and her puppy. The male corpse was missing a large part of its skull. Its jaw, however, was largely intact. This is where the story, which should have become clear, becomes impossibly murky. The Soviets, it seems, did not know what to do with their discovery. The remains were taken to a field hospital in the Berlin suburb of Buch. A top-secret autopsy was performed. The Soviet pathologists, led by Dr. Faust Shkrovsky, faced a problem. They had a charred body, no face, and no clear identifying features. But they had the teeth. They tracked down Kate Hoisterman, the dental assistant to Hitler's personal dentist, Professor Hugo Blaschke. They showed her the upper and lower jawbones recovered from the fire. Hoisterman, under intense pressure, identified them instantly. She pointed out the unique and bizarre dental work, a bridge on the upper right, a distinctive gold crown, a window-like filling. She described it from memory, and her description was a perfect match for the object the Soviets held in their hands. For the Soviets, the case was closed. They had proof. Hitler was dead, they had his jawbone. But Joseph Stalin had other plans. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, US President Harry Truman casually asked Stalin if he had any confirmation of Hitler's death. Stalin, stone-faced, replied no. He said Hitler was not dead, that he had escaped and was likely hiding in Spain or Argentina, spirited away by British or American sympathizers. This was a deliberate, catastrophic lie. Why? Stalin's motives remain a subject of debate. Perhaps he wanted to sow distrust between the Western allies, painting them as incompetent or worse, complicit. Perhaps he wanted to maintain the fascist threat as a justification for his iron grip on Eastern Europe. Or perhaps he simply reveled in the paranoia and chaos it created. Whatever his reason, the effect was immediate. Stalin, the man whose army had found the body, was telling the world that the body was never found. The Western allies were thrown into confusion. Britain's top intelligence agent, Hugh Trevor Roper, later a famed historian, was tasked to investigate the matter. His report, The Last Days of Hitler, concluded, based on eyewitness testimony, that Hitler was unequivocally dead. But the Soviets continued their campaign of obfuscation. They publicly denied finding a body. They presented contradictory reports. They even silenced their own investigators. Kate Hoisterman, the dental assistant who provided the positive ID, was sentenced to 10 years in a Soviet gulag, for no other reason than she knew the truth. The Soviets held the physical evidence, the jawbone and skull fragments, in a secret archive, admitting to their existence only decades later. This information vacuum was the perfect breeding ground for a conspiracy. If the Soviets said he escaped, and the Americans and British couldn't produce a body, then surely he must have escaped. The legend of Hitler's escape was not born on the fringes. It was created intentionally in the halls of the Kremlin. And then came the proof. In 2009, the world was stunned by a new scientific claim. Researchers from the University of Connecticut were given access to a piece of evidence held in the Russian state archives in Moscow. It was not the jawbone. It was a fragment of a skull with a clear bullet hole in it. For decades, the Soviets had claimed this fragment belonged to Adolf Hitler. The American team performed a DNA test on the skull fragment. The results were explosive. The DNA belonged to a woman, estimated to be between 20 and 40 years old. The headlines wrote themselves. Hitler's skull is a woman's. For the conspiracy theorists, this was the ultimate vindication. The cornerstone of the official story was a lie. The Soviets had faked the evidence. If the skull was fake, then the whole story was fake. This single event, more than any other, reignited the Hitler escape theory for a new generation. The narrative of this escape is in itself a cinematic epic. It is the story of Grey Wolf. According to this legend, the Hitler who died in the bunker was in fact a double. The real Hitler, possibly with Eva Braun, was spirited away from the bunker on April 28th or 29th. How? The theories vary. One popular version involves a small Arado 234, the world's first jet bomber, taking off from a makeshift runway on the east-west axis road, near the Berlin-Brandenburg tape, piloted by a famous test pilot, Haunebu. Haunebu did make a daring flight into Berlin and back out in the final days, but she took with her the new head of the Luftwaffe, not Hitler. The more popular and more elaborate theory involves a U-boat. In this telling, Hitler and his entourage were smuggled out of Berlin, traveled across a devastated Germany, and reached the port in either Denmark or Spain. There, they boarded a submarine, part of a secret convoy, and began a long journey south. Their destination, Patagonia, Argentina. This theory gained traction for a simple, compelling reason. It had happened before. Argentina, under President Perón, was famously sympathetic to the Nazis. Thousands of Nazi officials and collaborators, including the infamous Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, did escape to South America via rat lines organized by sympathizers within the Vatican and elsewhere. If they could do it, why not the Führer himself? The evidence in Argentina became the new focus. In July and August 1945, months after Germany's surrender, two German U-boats, U-530 and U-977, mysteriously surfaced in Mar del Plata, Argentina, and surrendered to authorities. The crews were interned, but the question remained, what had they been doing for 2 months? Had they been on the secret mission? Had they dropped off high-value passengers on the remote Patagonian coast? The U-boat commanders insisted they had not, that they had simply been trying to avoid surrendering to the Soviets. But the suspicion stuck. Then came the sightings. For decades, the FBI, under the skeptical and paranoid J. Edgar Hoover, was inundated with reports. Hitler was seen in a monastery in Spain. Hitler was a shepherd in the Swiss Alps. Hitler was working as a waiter in France. But the most detailed and most persistent sightings came from Argentina. Declassified FBI files show that the agency took many of these reports serious enough to investigate. One famous 1945 memo details a report from an Argentine informant who claimed Hitler had arrived via U-boat and was living in a large Bavarian-style mansion in the foothills of the Andes, near a town called Bariloche. This region, which looked remarkably like the German Alps, was a known haven for ex-Nazis. Books like Grey Wolf, The Escape of Hitler, took these scattered reports and wove them into a grand, cohesive narrative. They pointed to the Inalco House, a remote mansion on the shores of Lake Nahuel Huapi, as Hitler's residence in exile. They interviewed alleged witnesses who claimed to have seen or served El Patron, the boss. One author, Abel Basti, claimed Hitler and Eva Braun lived openly in Argentina, had 2 daughters, and that Hitler died of old age in 1971. Another theory, popularized by the TV series Hunting Hitler, suggested he died in 1962. The story was compelling. It had spies, U-boats, secret mansions, and government cover-ups. It had all the makings of a perfect thriller. And as we now know, it was almost entirely wrong. War is not always a matter of steel, and victory is not always decided by the weight of explosives. We think of the Second World War as a clash of titans, of massive armies and industrial might. a brutal arithmetic of tanks, planes, and men. And it was. But beneath this overt, thunderous conflict, another war was being fought. A war of shadows, of whispers, of illusions. A war fought by men who were masters of make-believe, whose greatest weapon was the human mind, and whose greatest triumph was to convince the enemy to fight an enemy that wasn't there. This is the story of the ghost soldiers of World War II. Section 1. The concept of the phantom soldier. When we hear the phrase ghost soldier, our minds might drift to the supernatural, to the spectral sentry said to haunt the battlefields of Gettysburg or the Somme, to the legends of angels at Mons. But the ghosts of the Second World War were real. They were flesh and blood. They were soldiers whose job was to be invisible, to impersonate, to deceive, and in some cases to simply disappear. Their battlefields were not just the muddy fields of France or the deserts of Africa. Their battlefields were the maps in the enemy's command tent, the frequencies of the enemy's radio sets, and the very imagination of the German High Command. The greatest, most audacious, and most theatrical of these units was an organization so secret its existence was denied for more than 50 years after the war ended. Its official designation was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. To the very few who knew of its existence, it had another name: the Ghost Army. This was a unit of just over 1,000 men, and their job was to impersonate entire divisions of the US Army. Divisions of 15, 20, even...
The idea was not entirely new. Deception, or maskirovka, as the Soviets would call it, is as old as war itself. The Trojan horse is the classic example. But World War II, a war of total industrial mobilization, demanded deception on an industrial scale. The British had pioneered many of these techniques with stunning success in North Africa. Under the direction of illusionist Jasper Maskelyne, they had hidden the entire city of Alexandria from German bombers using a sophisticated system of lights and shadows. Most famously, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, Operation Bertram created a massive phantom army, complete with dummy tanks, fake railway lines, and even a dummy pipeline, all to convince Rommel that the main British attack would come from the south, when in fact, it was planned for the north. It worked. It worked spectacularly. And the Americans, preparing for the invasion of mainland Europe, knew they needed their own masters of illusion. But who do you recruit for such a unit? Who is qualified to build a phantom army? You don't look to the infantry schools or the tank academies. You look to the art schools, the advertising agencies, the theaters, and the sound engineering labs. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was without a doubt the most bizarrely talented unit assembled in the entire US Army. It was a collection of painters, illustrators, architects, sound engineers, radio operators, and actors. Men who, in civilian life, designed displays for department stores or sketched for magazines, were now tasked with the ultimate design challenge: fating a war. Among their ranks were men who would later define post-war American culture. The fashion designer Bill Blass was a corporal in the Ghost Army, tasked with camouflage. The minimalist painter Ellsworth Kelly, his eye for form and shadow, worked on dummy equipment. The artist Arthur Singer, the wildlife illustrator, was another. These were not traditional soldiers. They were creative professionals given a top-secret, surreal, and incredibly dangerous mission: to lie to the entire German army. Their work was classified top secret. Their letters home were heavily censored. They were forbidden from keeping diaries. They were, in effect, ghosts in their own army, a unit that officially did not exist, moving silently alongside the real, heavy divisions marching toward Germany. Section 2. The Arsenal of Illusion. The Ghost Army's toolkit was divided into three main components, a trinity of deception designed to fool the three primary ways an enemy gathers intelligence: sight, sound, and radio signals. First came the visual deception, the spoof component. This was the work of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. These were the artists and architects. Their job was to create the physical presence of a massive army, and they did it with rubber. They wielded arsenal of inflatable, full-scale replicas of the US Army's most formidable hardware. They had M4 Sherman tanks, M10 tank destroyers, 155mm long-tom artillery pieces, jeeps, trucks, and even L-4 observation planes. From the air, to a German reconnaissance pilot flying at several thousand feet, these rubber decoys were indistinguishable from the real thing. But the illusion couldn't just be static. An army moves. So the men of the 603rd became masters of battlefield theater. They would inflate their dummy tanks, but they wouldn't just leave them sitting in a field. They would use bulldozers to carve fake tank tracks into the mud, leading to concealed positions. They would create fake headquarters with complete dummy radio antennae. They would even simulate repairs, leaving a few dummy tanks in a maintenance depot to suggest the wear and tear of a real unit. The soldiers of the Ghost Army were actors. They were instructed to be sloppy. A real heavy armored division trying to hide would be a model of camouflage discipline. But a division preparing to attack would be a little messy, a little brazen. So the Ghost Army would intentionally let their tanks be seen just enough to be caught by an enemy spy or a high-altitude photograph. They also engaged in what they called special effects. They would drive a few real trucks in a continuous dusty loop to simulate the arrival of a massive convoy. A handful of men would dig foxholes and fortifications for 1,000. It was a colossal, high-stakes stage play performed for the most dangerous audience in the world, and the stage was the front line. The second component of the illusion was sonic. An army doesn't just look like something, it sounds like something. A resting infantry division has a different audio footprint than an armored division assembling for an attack. The enemy knew these sounds. This is where the 3132 Signal Service Company Special came in. These were the sound engineers, men drawn from Hollywood studios and radio networks. Their mission was to create a soundtrack of war. They had traveled to Fort Knox and other military bases to make high-fidelity recordings of every sound an army makes. They recorded the clatter and squeal of Sherman tanks on the move, the rumble of half-tracks, the shouts of men digging in, the clinking of pontoon bridges being assembled. They captured the distinct sounds of different artillery pieces, both American and German. These sounds were then edited, mixed, and pressed onto state-of-the-art wire recorders, an early precursor to tape. In the field, the 3132 would roll out massive, 5-foot-tall speakers mounted on the backs of trucks and blast these symphonies of deception into the night. Their sound shows were sophisticated. They didn't just play a loop of tank noises. They understood acoustics. They knew that sound travels differently at night, that it bounces off hills, that it's dampened by forests. They would carefully position their speakers, sometimes miles apart, to create a believable, three-dimensional soundscape. They could make it sound like an entire armored division was arriving in a valley, moving into position, and preparing for an assault at dawn. To a German sound-ranging unit several miles away, listening through sensitive microphones, it was terrifyingly real. It was the unmistakable sound of an impending attack. The third and perhaps most intricate piece of the puzzle was radio deception, or spoof radio. In World War II, a huge amount of intelligence was gathered by listening to the enemy's radio traffic. A division has a unique radio fingerprint, the call signs, the frequencies they use, the volume of traffic, and even the unique idiosyncratic fist of each Morse code operator. The Ghost Army Signal Company was tasked with mimicking the radio networks of the divisions they were impersonating. They were meticulous forgers. When the Ghost Army was sent to replace a real division, say the 6th Armored, the Signal Company would study that division's radio habits for weeks. They would learn their procedures, their call signs, and even the specific tapping style of their key operators. Then, when the real 6th Armored packed up and moved out under cover of darkness, the Ghost Army's radio operators would move in, take over their frequencies, and begin broadcasting. To the German signals intelligence units listening in, it sounded as if the 6th Armored had never left. The operators would send fake coded messages, simulating the traffic of a 20,000-man division, requisitions for fuel, requests for ammunition, reports on enemy movements. It was a performance of electronic ghosts, designed to tie the enemy's intelligence in knots. These three elements, visual, sonic, and radio, combined to create a single, overwhelming, and utterly false reality. But this performance came with an extraordinary risk. The Ghost Army was a unit of only 1,100 men. When they were impersonating a 30,000-man force, they were deliberately drawing the enemy's attention. They were, in effect, panning a giant bullseye on their own backs. If the Germans ever decided to call their bluff, if they ever launched a probing attack or an artillery barrage on the division they thought was in front of them, the Ghost Army would not be able to fight back. They had a few machine guns and a handful of half-tracks. They were artists and engineers, not a frontline combat unit. Their only defense was the believability of their illusion. If the illusion failed, they would be annihilated. Section 3. The Phantom Offensive. The Ghost Army arrived in France just weeks after D-Day in July 1944. They were immediately put to work. They participated in over 20 distinct deception campaigns, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine. Their operations had code names that sounded like magic spells: Operation Elephant, Operation Bettenberg, Operation Viersen. In September 1944, during the fierce fighting to capture the port of Brest, the Ghost Army was called upon to fill a gap in the American line. A large number of troops were being repositioned, leaving a critical sector of the front dangerously thin. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops moved in, and for days they used their inflatable tanks and sonic trucks to convince the German garrison that they were facing a massive, reinforced U.S. division. They created the illusion of an army that was not there, holding the line with sound and rubber, and preventing the Germans from exploiting a weakness that could have led to a disastrous counterattack.
Another time, in Luxembourg, they were tasked with drawing German attention away from a planned advance by General Patton's Third Army. The Ghost Army set up their show in a position miles away from Patton's real thrust. They made a colossal racket. They broadcast the sounds of a full-scale armored assembly. They lit up the night with simulated activity. The Germans, convinced a major attack was imminent, shelled the Ghost Army's phantom positions with a ferocious artillery barrage. The shells rained down on empty fields and rubber tanks. The men of the Ghost Army, huddled in their foxholes, listened as the enemy wasted thousands of pounds of explosives on their illusions. Meanwhile, miles away, Patton's real attack went forward against significantly lightened resistance. But the Ghost Army's masterpiece, their grand finale, was Operation Viersen in March of 1945. This was the crossing of the Rhine, the final decisive push into the heart of Germany. The U.S. Ninth Army was tasked with a massive assault across the river, codenamed Operation Plunder. The German High Command knew an attack was coming. The Rhine was their last great natural defensive line, and it was heavily fortified. The Ninth Army's real crossing was planned for a stretch of river near the town of Rheinberg. The Ghost Army was given a mission: to convince the Germans that the crossing was happening 10 miles south, near Dusseldorf. If they succeeded, they could trick the Germans into moving their reserves and artillery to the wrong place, saving thousands of American lives during the real assault. This was the Ghost Army's largest and most complex performance. They were asked to simulate not one, but two full infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, a force of over 30,000 men. The 23rd moved into position. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers began to assemble their Phantom Army. Hundreds of inflatable tanks and artillery pieces were massed in the woods, just visible enough for German reconnaissance. They built dummy airfields, dummy command posts, and dummy fuel depots. They even trucked in real artillery units, had them fire for a day to register their positions with the enemy, and then trucked them out, replacing them with rubber guns. Then, the 3132nd Sonic Company began its show. For days, they played the sounds of an army preparing for a river crossing. The primary sound was of construction, the unmistakable clang of metal on metal, the rumble of engines, the shouts of engineering crews, all suggesting that pontoon bridges were being secretly assembled at night, ready to be deployed. The Signal Company, meanwhile, was broadcasting a storm of radio traffic, perfectly mimicking the call signs and procedures of the 30th and 79th Divisions, confirming to German listeners that this was indeed the assembly point for the main attack. To complete the illusion, the Special Effects Company went into overdrive. They drove trucks with lights on at night, drawing artillery fire. They sewed the patches of the 30th and 79th Divisions onto their own uniforms and swaggered into the nearby towns, deliberately spreading rumors in cafes and bars where they knew German informants might be listening. They created the perfect multi-sensory illusion of an impending assault. The Germans took the bait completely. German intelligence reports from the period, later captured, confirmed their belief that the main U.S. crossing would happen at Dusseldorf. They reoriented their defenses. 2 panzer divisions and multiple artillery batteries were moved south to face the Ghost Army. On the night of March 23, 1945, the Germans unleashed a cataclysmic artillery barrage on the Ghost Army's position. For an hour, shells screamed from the sky, tearing the rubber tanks to shreds, cratering the empty fields, and blasting the loudspeakers that were, even then, broadcasting the sounds of an army that wasn't there. And 10 miles to the north, at Rheinberg, the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine under the cover of darkness. They met with scattered, disorganized resistance. The German guns that should have been waiting for them were busy shelling a field of rubber. The Rhine crossing was a stunning success, and the casualties were a fraction of what planners had feared. The Ghost Army had staged the performance of their lives. It is estimated by their own commanders that this single 2-day deception may have saved between 10,000 and 30,000 American lives. They had fought one of the most decisive battles of the war, and they had done it without firing a shot in anger. They had won with imagination. Section 4. The Other Ghosts. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were the most formalized ghost unit, but they were not the only phantoms of the war. The conflict was filled with men and women whose entire existence was a form of deception. Think of the shadow armies of the resistance. In France, Poland, Norway, and across occupied Europe, citizen soldiers operated as ghosts within their own homelands. They had no uniforms, no insignia, no tanks. They were bakers, teachers, and farmers by day, and saboteurs by night. They moved through the cracks in the occupation, supplied by mysterious nighttime drops from the British Special Operations Executive and the American OSS. The SOE itself was an organization of ghosts. Its agents, men and women like Violet Sabot or Nancy Wake, were trained in the arts of silent killing, sabotage, and deception. They were dropped behind enemy lines with new identities, false papers, and a mission to set Europe ablaze. They were not an army. They were a rumor, a whisper of resistance that tied down hundreds of thousands of German troops who were forced to hunt for phantoms in their own rear. And then there was perhaps the most ghostly soldier of all. This was a centerpiece of Operation Mincemeat, a deception plot so brilliant it borders on the absurd. In 1943, Allied planners were preparing to invade Sicily. The problem was, Sicily was the most obvious target. To achieve surprise, they needed to convince the Germans they were invading somewhere else, specifically Greece. The plan was audacious. British intelligence obtained the body of a homeless man who had died from pneumonia. They gave him a new ghostly identity, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They dressed him in a uniform, chained the briefcase to his wrist, and filled it with masterfully forged secret documents. These documents detailed a complex, entirely fictional Allied plan to invade Greece. Major Martin was then dropped from a submarine off the coast of Spain, where his body, briefcase intact, would wash ashore and be found by the pro-German Spanish authorities. The British knew the Spanish would turn the documents over to the Germans. The German High Command fell for it. They scrutinized the papers, believed they had intercepted the Allies' most secret plans, and immediately began reinforcing Greece and Sardinia. Hitler himself ordered panzer divisions to be moved. When the Allies finally landed in Sicily, they found a relatively light defense. The Germans were waiting for an invasion in the wrong country, all because of the intel provided by a ghost. But there is a darker side to the idea of the ghostly soldier. This was not just a tactic used by the Allies, it was also a tool of terror. In 1941, Adolf Hitler issued the Nacht- and Nebel Decree, the Night and Fog Directive. This order was aimed at the resistance and political opponents in occupied territories. It stated that any person deemed a threat to German security was to be arrested and disappear into the night and fog. They were not to be given trials. Their families were not to be notified. They were to be shipped to concentration camps, and their very existence was to be erased from all records. These were the forced ghosts, men and women who were alive, but to whom the outside world had vanished without a trace. It was a form of psychological warfare designed to sow terror and uncertainty, leaving families to wonder for years if their loved ones were alive or dead. It was the ultimate, terrifying perversion of the ghost soldier concept, not an illusion to deceive an army, but an administrative void to break the spirit of a nation. Section 5. The Legacy of Silence. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the real army celebrated. There were parades in Paris, London, and New York. Soldiers returned home as heroes, telling the stories of the battles they had fought, the towns they had liberated. But the men of the Ghost Army could not.
Their methods, their tactics, their very existence remained classified as top secret. The art of sonic and visual deception was deemed too valuable to be made public, especially as the world was already chilling into a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. So the soldiers of the 23rd returned to their civilian lives, to their art studios and advertising agencies, and they kept silent. They could not tell their families, their wives, or their friends what they had really done. They couldn't explain that their artwork had saved lives, or that their knowledge of acoustics had fooled a German panzer division. They were heroes who were forbidden from claiming their own heroism. For 51 years, the story of the Ghost Army remained a secret, buried in classified government archives. The men grew old. Many of them died, taking their silent stories with them. It was not until 1996 that the operation was finally declassified. Only then did the surviving veterans, men in their 70s and 80s, finally get to speak about their Phantom War. Only then did the world learn of the rubber army that had held the line at Brest, or the symphony of deception that had cleared the way across the Rhine. The story of the ghost soldiers of World War II teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of conflict. It shows us that war is not just a test of strength, but a battle of perceptions. It is a human drama, a contest of wits, and sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bomb, but an idea. The men of the Ghost Army were not supernatural spirits. They were flesh and blood illusionists. They were artists who understood that the line between reality and perception is often fatally thin. They wielded creativity as a weapon, and in doing so, they proved that a single well-crafted lie can be more powerful and ultimately more humane than 1,000-gun barrage. They were the army that wasn't there, the spectral regiment whose greatest victory was remaining invisible. Their legacy, once shrouded in secrecy, is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most important battles are won not by the soldiers we see, but by the ghosts we don't.